Earlier in the interview, Kieran had said to Mallory, "You know more about me than my wife knows about me. You know more about me than maybe I know about me," which is it's such an extraordinary thing to say. But this is a man who's been living a lie for 30 years.
In the summer of 2019, a homeless man walked into a Los Angeles bank, claiming that his life had been stolen. His identity, his name, all gone. And in its place, over $200,000 debt. What happened next would reveal just how far a stolen life can travel, and just how high the price of that life can be. Charlie McCann is a feature writer for The Economist, and she untangled this mystery in her article called The Two Lives of William Woods. I'm Kathleen Goldhar, and this is Crime Story. Charlie, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much, Kathleen. Great to be here.
So you start this article in a bank in the summer of 2019. Can you bring me back to that moment and describe what happened?
Yeah, so this homeless man claiming to be called William Woods, he arrives at the bank and he says that he has this problem. Someone has stolen his identity. They run up a bunch of debt in his name, and he wants to close the bank accounts. And so the bank teller asks him for his identity documents. He supplies them. It's his driver's license, his social security card. And the teller notices that the bank accounts in question were opened in a different state, in Wisconsin, not California. And he thinks that's kind of funny. So he asks the man standing in front of him a bunch of security questions. When did you open these accounts? That kind of thing. And William Woods, as we know him, is unable to answer those questions. So the teller calls the phone number associated with the accounts, and someone else answers the phone and says he has not authorized anyone to close his accounts, hasn't been in California in recent time. So the teller calls the police. The police arrive. They suspect that the man standing in front of them is himself attempting to steal the money in the bank using fraudulent identity documents. And he is eventually taken down to the station and charged with identity theft and false impersonation.
What happens while he's in prison? Does anybody believe him? Where does this case go at this point?
So, the case goes to court, and he spends the whole time pleading his innocence. This court case drags on and on and on because it's in the middle of the pandemic. And so it lasts for 6 months. And this whole time, as I say, he's saying, "I'm innocent. I am William Woods." But at the same time, he's also saying some kind of weird stuff about the FBI, the World Trade Center, 9/11. Sometimes it can be a little hard to understand what exactly he's saying. He doesn't make a lot of sense. He has a habit of interrupting the judge. And so what happens at the 6-month mark here is that he is deemed incompetent to stand trial, and he is admitted to a state mental hospital where he's administered psychotropic drugs. And he's there for about 5 months, at which point he's deemed competent to stand trial once again. By that point, I think it's 2021 by this point. So he's been in the system, in prison or in hospital, in jail or in hospital, for about a year and a half by this point. And so his attorney, his court-appointed lawyer, says to him, "Look, if you plead no contest to the charges, we can do you a deal. You'll be let out on time served, and you can just put this whole ordeal behind you." And so that's what he does.
And does he spend any more time in prison at that point?
No, he's let out at that point. He walks out the same day.
Okay. Why doesn't the story stop there? What happens that gets to the point where you decide you're going to be able to write a story about it in the magazine?
Yeah, this is the crazy thing. I mean, there wouldn't have been a story here if William Woods hadn't kept on insisting that he is who he is. I mean, as part of the condition for his release, he was told by the judge, he was ordered by the judge not to use this name, William Woods. He was told, that is not your name. You cannot use it. If you do, you may go back into prison.
Can I just ask you, though, because he had identification. Like you said, he had a social insurance number, and did you say a birth certificate?
Yeah, he had a birth certificate. He had a social security card. He had his driver's license. That's right.
What did they say about it? Did they think he had those were fake?
The detective who investigated the case and testified in court said that he believed that in the state of California, it is possible for homeless people to get identification without proof of identification. And it's my understanding that that's actually mistaken. Nonetheless, that was his belief. And it seems that the judge found that to be compelling.
Okay. So basically it was dismissed. They didn't think he was who he says he was, but he does get out. And I'm sorry, let's keep going. So how does it get on your radar? What does he do to kind of not let this go?
He's obviously told the LAPD this. They're not interested. He tracks down the man who he believes has stolen his identity. And he informs the local police department in that man's town of Heartland, Wisconsin. They don't do anything about it. Eventually, he finds out where this guy works. And he tells his employers.
Can we talk, because this isn't some random person in either of their lives.
Yeah. And so maybe I'll refer to them in the way that the detective referred to them as California Bill and Wisconsin Bill. They met in 1988 in Albuquerque in New Mexico. And they didn't know each other well, but they were both working as hot dog vendors. California Bill had his hot dog stand just a couple of blocks away from Wisconsin Bill's hot dog stand. And they'd spoken once or twice. And according to California Bill, he didn't really like Wisconsin Bill. He says that Wisconsin Bill had talked about dealing drugs, was kind of boasting about himself as a kind of a gangster. And so California Bill wanted to keep his distance. But one morning when he was setting up his hot dog stand, his employer and Wisconsin Bill, they arrive, they're, in this big truck, they're unloading the hot dog stand, and they help out California Bill as he's setting up for the day. And, they're just going about their business. California Bill happens to leave his wallet out on the stand. Then they leave, his employer and Wisconsin Bill. And then that's when California Bill realizes his wallet is missing. And he suspects Wisconsin Bill. Later that day, this is 1988, sort of before the days of cell phones, right? So when his employer comes to pick him up at the end of his shift, he tells him what's happened. And they go straight to Wisconsin Bill's hot dog stand, and they confront him. And Wisconsin Bill gets out the wallet, gives it back to California Bill. He gets the $40 that he'd stolen from the till and gives it back to his employer. And he's fired on the spot.
And just to add a more complicated nature to this, at the time in 1988, Wisconsin Bill obviously is not saying his name is Bill. What's his name at that moment?
At that time, he's Matthew Cairns.
Okay. So let's get back to more of the present. California Bill ends up in prison, gets out of prison. How does this story come to your attention?
So the detective is on the case, and what he eventually finds out is that California Bill is not the perpetrator. It's Wisconsin Bill. It's Wisconsin Bill who stole California Bill's identity back in 1988. When he'd taken that wallet, he must have written down all of California Bill's personal details. He got all that information. And it transpires that shortly after that, he began living as Bill Woods.
Bill Woods in Wisconsin.
He didn't go to Wisconsin immediately. He kind of bounced around the country. There are records of him committing crimes in, San Francisco. I think he was in Colorado as well. So he kind of bounced around, but he eventually wound up in Wisconsin. That's right. And so, because you asked, how does this come to my attention? Mm-hmm. So the detective finds this out, and then Wisconsin Bill, or Matthew Cairns, as he is really, he's charged with various crimes, among them identity theft, and he pleads guilty and is sentenced. And, basically every journalist in the country kind of pounced on this story because it's such a wild story. And so that's how I heard about it. I just read about it in the news like everyone else. But nobody had written a feature story about it. And I thought there was definitely scope here to, it's just such an insane story. And so I thought, what does this do to a man like Bill Woods, like California Bill? To have as you put it so well, Kathleen, to have your life taken from you in this way. What does that do to a man? And then on the flip side, why did this guy do it? Why did Matthew Cairns do it? He's such an enigma, and we can get into the kind of the detail there. But one of the questions I had, if I can get into it, is, after he stole California Bill's identity, he did commit a few crimes here and there for sure, but basically from the early 90s onward for about 30 years. As far as we know, he lived as a law-abiding citizen.
Yeah, that was really, I think, what is so gripping about this story. I just want to talk a little bit about Matthew Cairns because let's start at the beginning of his life. Like he did come from, he was a troubled person. Can we say it that way?
Yeah, definitely. I managed to find his brother, who spoke about Matthew's childhood. And, it sounds like he had a very tough time growing up. They were raised in a very disciplinarian household. Their father was a former Navy man, and was pretty strict. And if they broke the rules, they get hit with the switch. When they were older, if they broke the rules, they'd get a punch in the shoulder. So it was, a pretty strict upbringing. And Matthew had a very bad clubfoot, which was very pronounced. He had a limp. And he, by the sounds of it, was just really badly teased. And, by his brother's telling, this is just somebody who was in a lot of pain. The two boys were adopted. And so on top of the bullying and from his classmates and the pretty harsh treatment from their father, Matthew just had this sense of not belonging. And he lashed out. I guess his way of coping with those feelings was to lash out. And so, he'd hit his brother when things, as he got older, sort of bigger. When, things didn't go away, he'd hit people, he'd fight them. His brother Patrick has this memory of him throwing a kitten off a roof and watching it twitch and just slowly die. And Patrick, his brother, was horrified by this. Matthew was not horrified. Matthew, it sounds like, took pleasure in watching this thing that he had total control over dying this death. And so his brother Patrick paints this pretty dark picture. When he is a bit older, he starts to fall into a bad crowd. He's stealing a lot. He's doing drugs. He's doing things which Patrick thinks were intended to ingratiate himself in this kind of cool crowd. Again, it's that sense of not belonging and trying desperately wanting to belong and doing the things that he thinks will make him part of the in crowd. So Matthew Cairns, the man who William Woods alleges has stolen his identity, he was an IT administrator at the University of Iowa Hospital. And the case falls on the desk of a detective, Detective Ian Mallory. When Mallory sees this case, he thinks it's a pretty straightforward case of stolen identity. He gets a call from Matthew Kearns, the man who this allegation has been made about. And Matthew Kearns just wants to get a sense of what's going on. You know, he complains about this man. He says, this guy's been hounding me for years. I have done everything I can to put a stop to it. This guy has even served time for stealing my identity, and yet he won't quit. And he tells the detective, frankly, I don't know what you can do about this because, the LAPD have tried, various different authorities have tried, and nothing's worked. And this is a crucial turning point because, Mallory he's a campus cop. And he's used to people underestimating him. They think he's just a kind of security guy. And when he hears Kieran say he doesn't think he's going to be able to do very much about this, that really spurs him on because Mallory wants to help this guy. He also wants to prove him wrong. He wants to prove his worth as a genuine detective. And so that's when he gets on the case. And it turns out things aren't what they seem.
How does Mallory eventually catch Wisconsin Bill?
So what he does is he gets all this paperwork together, everything he can find under the name William Woods. And it transpires that their records, their government records, police records, all of that have been merged into one case file. So he's looking for clues in the paperwork that will distinguish the two in some way. And what he eventually notices is, so he gets Wisconsin Bill's birth certificate, and he gets California Bill's birth certificate. California Bill's certificate looks pretty legit. It's a photocopy of the original. Fine. Wisconsin Bill's looks kind of weird. It's a reprint, and it's much shorter than would be the norm. It's missing some key information, like the name of the hospital, for instance. So he thinks, okay, that's pretty weird. Then he also notices there's a discrepancy between Wisconsin Bill's driver's license and his birth certificate. The middle name is different. And he calls Wisconsin Bill about that. And it's like, what's going on here? And Wisconsin Bill says, my real middle name is Donald, but I go by David sometimes. And apparently that was enough for the LAPD, but it was not enough for Mallory. So what he does is, both these birth certificates are registered to Kentucky. So he calls up Kentucky's Office of Vital Statistics to ask, because the Wisconsin Bill's birth certificate looks kind of weird. And so he's like, is this legit? And they say, yeah, it does look legit to us. But in the course of having this conversation, he discovers that to get a reprint of a birth certificate in Kentucky, all you need to provide is the basic information that would appear on that birth certificate. So you need to know the name of the parents, that kind of thing. You don't need to provide any proof of identity. And Mallory thought that was pretty interesting. So he begins to suspect Wisconsin Bill. Eventually what he does is he's able to track down one of the two parents on the birth certificate. So the mother has died, but the father is still alive. And so he goes to, he doesn't go. He calls up Billy Don Woods, the father, and they get to talking. He explains the situation. Billy Don Woods isn't in close contact with his son, but he does know that he has at times lived in California. And so what Detective Mallory does is he gets a couple of cops in Kentucky to go to Billy's house and take a DNA sample. He gets a DNA sample from California Bill, and there's a match. So we know California Bill is the real William Woods.
But do you think, it sounds pretty clear to me that the LA police dismissed the real Bill because he was homeless. it doesn't sound like Mallory did, or at least was open enough to sort of maybe see that the story wasn't exactly as Wisconsin Bill said it was. So there is like a difference in the way two different police or detectives approach the story.
That's right. And yeah, it's very much to his credit that Detective Mallory, knowing that this guy was homeless, knowing that he wasn't super credible at times, decided to persist with it anyway. The LAPD did not want to talk, so I can't speak to what they were thinking. But there was clearly a miscarriage of justice that was done here. And I don't think it's unreasonable to think that the LAPD could have done a much better job than they did.
How does William Woods in California, when he looks back on this, how does he sort of interpret what happened?
He's incredibly, he's angry, I think, that so much has been taken from him. He has a very interesting way of looking at the world. I mean, in a way, I think he feels that he's been persecuted all of his life. When you start talking to him, you quickly realize how he has fit the saga with Kieran's into this narrative of his life. He's just had a terrible time of it.
Tell me more about his life and his upbringing.
So he was born in Kentucky. His parents divorced not long after he was born, a few years after he was born. He saw his father very rarely after the age of 5. And around then, his mother relocated the family with her new husband to Florida. And that was really the worst thing that could have happened to Bill Woods, because his mother was a drug addict. She presided over this incredibly chaotic and abusive household. She attempted to kill her son, according to Bill Woods. So I asked him to tell me more about that, and he referred to 2 specific incidents. One in which she put him on the stove when he was in diapers, turned it on, and just kept him there. And then another incident several years later when she opened the cabinet containing the kitchen chemicals and encouraged him to inhale them. Later on, he claims that she sexually abused him. And so eventually he manages to, escape his mother, and he goes to stay with family in Michigan. He goes to community college for a little bit. He studies electrical engineering. And he works, a few odd jobs here and there, and eventually makes his way down to Albuquerque, I think in his early 20s. And that, of course, is where the incident with the wallet at the hot dog stand happens. But, as he told me more and more of his story, it's not just his mother that persecuted him. He, that she is involved, or was involved rather, with this circle of people who smuggle drugs into the country from Mexico. He said that there were some big names involved in this drug smuggling network. He also claimed that his mother played a role in 9/11. And so just, right. I mentioned conspiracy theories, right? There's a paranoia there. But setting aside the question of whether any of this is real or not, I'm just trying to give a flavor of how he thinks about the world.
Right.
And so there is this network of drug smuggling cops who persecuted him, who his mother knew, and who Matthew Kieran's knew.
Okay.
And Matthew Kieran's was involved in that. And so that's how he thinks about the world. He has been persecuted time and again, but how he responds to that is he informs the authorities. He tries to ensure that justice is done to some degree. And that's why, despite all the odds, despite being thrown in prison for claiming that he was who he is, he persisted with this. He kept on saying, I am William Woods, because that's what he's done all his life.
What did Matthew Kieran's illegal activity with William Woods' name do?
Well, this is the interesting thing. So in the first few years after he steals the identity, I think he steals a couple of cars as William Woods.
And does he get in trouble for that?
I think there are arrest warrants out for him, but basically no, because he always kind of skips town.
Right.
So he never gets in trouble for it.
But he was known as William Woods at the time, and the cops thought they were looking for someone named William Woods who was stealing cars. Yeah, okay.
Exactly. Then in the early 90s, he meets the woman who became his wife. And it seems, as far as we know, that he turns a leaf. And they get married, and he starts teaching himself computer science at night. And basically, kind of builds a career for himself as a successful IT professional. They have a kid, and as far as we know, he kind of transforms himself into this like respectable middle-class family man.
But he does accrue debt under William Woods' name, correct?
Yeah, I mean, I think he has a few credit cards, and so I think there was a balance on those credit cards.
Right.
Yeah. He's eventually charged with making a false statement to a credit union.
Okay.
Because he ran up over $250,000 using Woods' name.
Did his wife think his name was William Woods? And his kid?
Yeah. They did. And his kid thought he was Bill Woods. So his last name is Woods.
Oh my God.
Still is Woods.
Wow.
Yeah, so I wasn't able to speak to either of them, but the mind boggles. At some point, Wisconsin Bill had a conversation with his wife where he effectively had to introduce himself to her.
Yeah.
As Matthew Cairns. And I just can't imagine what that must have been like for her.
I mean, the name thing is so interesting, too. Did California Bill stop using his real name because he was told he had to?
No, never.
Okay.
He was always William Woods. I mean, that is, he was always consistent about that.
I mean, it's interesting. California Bill got thrown into prison and told that he was using a fake identity, but did anybody ever even try to figure out what his quote-unquote real identity was?
This is where it becomes unclear. In the court records of that case, at some point, it is suggested that his real name is Matthew Cairns.
Oh, really?
And it's not clear why. My impression is that, as I was saying earlier, their government document, their file is merged, right? These police records, et cetera, they're all merged. And so, but in those files, the name Matthew David Cairns does pop up once. And so it may be that the investigating detective, the prosecutors see that somehow and think, oh, that's who this guy really is. It's not clear. I don't know. But that's the extraordinary thing. Like, after the real William Woods was released from jail, having pled no contest to the charges, he's ordered by the judge not to use his real name. The judge says, your real name is Matthew Cairns.
Wow. It's so complicated, eh? Like, just the files and everything. It's like, how do you untangle this story? What happens to Matthew Cairns once Detective Mallory figures this all out? This university cop who everybody underestimated.
Yeah. Well, he's arrested. They basically they figure out that he's going to be at the office one day, and he is under sort of false pretenses sent to a conference room in the hospital, and that's where Detective Mallory and a bunch of other cops are. And so he's arrested and he's taken to the station and he interrogates him. And that in itself is such an interesting story. To have been a fly on the wall there would have been great.
You've read the transcript, so tell me about what.
Well, I unfortunately, I wasn't. I haven't read the transcript of the interrogation, but I spoke to Detective Mallory about it, and so he kind of relayed it to me.
What happened?
And so They're there for hours, 6 hours. And the reason they're there for so long is because Kieran's will not confess. He is adamant that he is William Woods and that this has all been some mistake and all the rest of it. And it's so interesting to watch him at work, I think, for the detective, because he can see the detective called him a master manipulator. Mm-hmm. As soon as he gets into the cop car, he's figuring out the lay of the land. He starts, he calls the detective by his first name. He wants to be friends. He figures out that Detective Mallory has a background in, as he put it, computer nerd things. And so they're kind of connecting on that level. And yeah, as detective put it, he wants to be his friend.
Yeah.
And so they're doing this dance. Again, Kieran's does not want to confess. And it's just going on and on and on and on. But eventually, Kieran's slips up because he says that his father died, which is true. His
real
Matthew
father
Kieran's
died.
father died,
Yeah.
right? But Billy Woods, very much alive. And so Mallory hops on that and he says, but I found your father. He's alive. And Kieran's is taken aback. And he pretty quickly pivots and starts saying, well, did he tell you that he used to beat us? Did he tell you that he was an alcoholic, that he did all these awful things to my mother? And again, it's like he's trying to manipulate the situation.
Yeah.
He's trying to make out that he's the victim, trying to get Detective Mallory on side. The detective isn't buying any of it. He just, presses forward. And he says, what's your dad's name? And Kieran says, John. John is the name of his real father, but it's not Billy Woods' name.
Wow.
And so Kieran's kind of catches himself and tries to kind of correct the answer, but it's too late. And even then, he tries to kind of maintain this charade that he is still William Woods, but eventually he realizes that he's outed himself. And so he starts to realize that the game is up and he starts to agonize over what the future holds for him. He's worried that his wife is going to leave him. And they start to talk about how he did it. So one of the things that comes up is that he researched Bill Woods' family on Ancestry.com, which is where he managed to get the name of his father and mother, all the information that he would need to get his birth certificate. And I think at about midnight, they eventually conclude the interview, and Kieran's asks Woods to come with him to the jail where he's going to be booked, and Mallory does that. By this point, as Mallory put it to me, they're kind of bonded, which is an extraordinary thing to say. But earlier in the interview, Kieran had said to Mallory, you know more about me than my wife knows about me. You know more about me than maybe I know about me, which is it's such an extraordinary thing to say. But this is a man who's been living a lie for 30 years. And he clearly, I don't know, I haven't managed to speak to him, but how do you do that? Presumably it involves just walling off that side of you, the side of you that was Matthew Kieran's. And so here is this detective who is able to join these two sides of your life, Matthew Kieran's and Bill Woods. So they go to the jail so that Kieran's can be booked, and the officers there ask him for his information. And what happens next just blew Mallory's mind, because Matthew David Kieran's then gives all the information of Bill Woods.
Jesus.
He says, my name is William Woods. And Mallory was just gobsmacked, but he didn't do anything. He just, he didn't intervene. I think he figured, this is somebody who's been living as William Woods for 30 years. It's going to take a little while for him to sort of drop the mask, as it were. But by the next day, he asked, they continued the interview, and he asked the detective to call him Matt.
And what happened to Matt?
So Matt pleads guilty to the charges, and he is sentenced to 12 years in a federal prison.
12 years.
And he is ordered to pay William Woods restitution of just over $6,000, which doesn't seem like a lot, I gotta say.
Yeah.
But the rationale there, I think, was that because William Woods was homeless for so much of that time, it was difficult to say how much, he hadn't lost much in earnings, which is how they would have calculated the restitution. So he's in prison, and he is apparently reading a lot of philosophy, according to his wife.
And she's still his wife?
I'll just say, as far as I know, yes.
Still his wife.
She's stuck with him.
And how about the real William Woods? What was the fallout for him?
He, he's got his name back. Mm-hmm. His conviction was vacated because he was wrongfully imprisoned. He was entitled to compensation from California, which he got. So that's over $80,000. And he is hoping to sue. It's unclear who he intends to sue, but possibly Matthew Kierans, possibly the LAPD, possibly the bank, where Matthew Kierans opened these accounts in his name. And I think he just wants to get his life back on track. He told me about possibly buying a house in Mexico. He wants to get his jewelry business up and running again. He used to buy and sell jewelry. So, yeah, I think he's looking to the future. But it's how do you get over something like this? He has some money coming in, which is great. So he has the means to to plan a bit of a future for himself. But he's, he's a very sweet-natured, agreeable man. And, when I'd ask him about what impact this had on him, for instance, the psychotropic drugs that he was forced to take at hospital, what did that do to you?
Yeah.
And he insisted, that he spat it out, the pills when he could, or he's very fond of Yukon Jack, which I think is a Canadian liqueur.
Oh.
I don't know. Anyway, it's pretty strong stuff apparently, and he claimed that he drank enough of it that psychotropic drugs wouldn't have much of an effect. So he's incredibly, for someone to whom so much has happened, who's lived such a difficult life, he's very upbeat. But I spoke to his employer, a man named Eric Kilmer, he's the guy who hired him to work at the hot dog stand. They've been in touch all this time. He's still employing him today. And they're friends. And he certainly noticed a change in Bill Woods. He thinks it's harder for him to focus, and he's more conspiratorial, and he needs to tell his story. And he tells it again and again and again and again, which makes total sense. I mean, you'd have to process this somehow. And so it seems that's how he's doing it. He has this kind of compulsion to talk about it.
Where do you think the accountability lies for all of this?
The LAPD, the LA District Attorney's Office, they did not do their jobs. They really didn't. Something went wrong with the cops' investigation into this. So they really did not do their due diligence. And the consequences of that have been horrendous. I mean, that did so much damage to Bill Woods.
Yeah. It
And,
was,
and on a psychic level, I mean, he was in jail and the state mental hospital being, because people were telling him again and again and again, you're not who you say you are. I mean, what does that do to someone?
yeah, and be told not to be able to use your own name.
Yeah, yeah.
And knowing that it's because of your situation. Like, clearly it was a dismissal of a man who they saw as untrustworthy because he was homeless.
Totally. I mean, don't judge a book by its cover, kind of thing. On the one hand, I can see why they thought that, because having spent some time with him, there is a strain of paranoia there, and he doesn't always make that much sense. And so I can see why they thought that for sure. But as Detective Mallory showed, if they had just done their jobs, if they had set aside their preconceptions about this guy and done a thorough investigation, they would have found out who the real criminal was.
Charlie, it was really nice to meet you. And thank you for the work, and thanks for coming on the show.
Likewise. Thank you so much for having me.
You've been listening to Crime Story from CBC Podcasts. You can hear the show ad-free by subscribing to CBC True Crime on Apple Podcasts. Be sure to follow us there on Apple or on Spotify. You can also find us on YouTube, where we release video episodes every week. Just search and subscribe to CBC True Crime.